Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, The baths of Caracalla were not a place for the elite alone. They were a microcosm of the Roman world. Marble and mosaics, sweat and silence, murmurs and meetings, senators and slaves, a world apart, but also a world of routine, a public spectacle, not because of drama, but because of daily exposure. Men stripped bare under vaulted ceilings, their bodies displayed not for beauty, but for the efficiency of routine, sweat, scrape, rinse, and recline. In a culture obsessed with control, even hygiene became a civic ritual. You enter around the 3rd hour after sunrise. The sun has begun to dry the morning fog clinging to the rooftops of the Aventine and Sicilian hills, the road leading to the Thermae Antonine. As the baths of Caracalla were officially known, is already busy with carts, chatter, and the soft slap of sandals. It is the year 219 CE. The city is loud, but the baths will be louder, and that's expected. They were built for spectacle, yes, but also for sound. Their towering walls amplify footsteps and arguments alike. You step beneath the high arches, beneath stone shaped by thousands of hands. The first thing you notice isn't the heat, it's the smell. Not unpleasant, not fragrant, just dense. Olive oil and charcoal, iron and steam. It's the smell of sweat suspended in marble. You join the crowd passing through the apodidarium, the changing room. Dozens of niches carved into the walls, lined with benches. You leave your tunic with an attendant, a young slave with quiet eyes and oil-stained fingers. He offers a basket. Coy. You nod, and he locks your items behind an iron grate. He ties the key to a string and slips it around your wrist. You are now one of many, naked, anonymous, ordinary, and that is the point. Here, the body is stripped of status. A senator might stand beside a baker, a soldier next to a scribe. Muscles might speak louder than marble busts, but even those, too, are present. Dozens of statues flank the corridors and niches. Gods, emperors, athletes. The reminder, the Roman body is not just functional, but symbolic. It is architecture. It must be maintained. You follow the stream of bodies into the frigidarium, the cold room. Tall columns rise to meet an open dome, cracked slightly to let in the air. Pools of cold water shimmer beneath painted ceilings. You don't linger. Few do. The cold is meant to wake the skin, tighten the pores, prepare you. You pass into the tepidarium. It's a warm room. This is the heart of the ritual. Here, bodies acclimate. Not too hot, not too cold. Stone benches line the edges of the room. Light filters through high windows, flickering over colored tiles. Some talk, others meditate. An older man recites lines from Virgil under his breath. Nearby, a group of teenagers dare each other to jump fully into the plunge basin. A vendor passes with dates and flatbread. Eating in the baths is not banned, but decorum is expected. And then, finally, the caldarium, the hot room. This is where the cleansing truly begins. Your feet slap softly against the heated floor. The air is thick. Steam curls in every corner, clinging to the vaulted ceilings like incense. Men sit on low stools. They rub themselves with oil, not soap. The Romans don't believe in it. Oil is used to loosen dirt. Then comes the strigil, a curved metal blade, scrapes the skin clean. Not gently. You kneel, an attendant, trained, silent coats your back with olive oil. He scrapes downward in long strokes. Dirt, sweat, and oil gather on the blade's edge. He wipes it on the cloth. He does not speak unless spoken to. This is not intimacy. This is service. In the corner, a wealthy equestrian argues with the magistrate about grain prices. They pause as a strigil slips. Blood dots the thigh. The man winces. No one reacts. It is part of the ritual. The water here is drawn from great aqueducts, Aqua Marcia and Aqua Antoniana, their names echoing imperial grandeur, heated in furnaces beneath, the floor by slave-tended fires. It takes hundreds of laborers to keep the baths hot. You never see them. Their work is underground. They feed the heat. Quietly, you sit, you sweat. The heat pulls the thoughts from your body. There is no urgency, no purpose beyond cleansing. And yet, here, in this steam-thick silence, the business of Rome continues. Deals are whispered, marriages arranged, poems recited. The public bath is not leisure, it is life. After the caldarium, you return perhaps to the palestra, the exercise yard. Not everyone does. Some prefer to end with a final plunge in the cold. Others linger in the tepidarium, sipping wine and watching others spar. In the yard, men wrestle, throw javelins, and leap through exercises in rhythm. A boy sings a counting song. A woman watches from behind a lattice screen. Women have their own baths, but on some days, the schedule allows them to observe. You dress slowly. The slave returns your tunic, folded. Your sandals are cleaner than you remember. You slip the key from your wrist and hand it back. He nods. You walk back into the streets of Rome. The noise feels different now, sharper. The sun higher. Your skin is clean. But more than that, you are reintegrated in a world of noise, power, hunger, and spectacle. This is one place where the body is rebalanced, not honored, not quite, but tuned, like an instrument, like a machine of empire still. You wonder, for all the marble, the heat, the routine, who really owned this experience? Was it the emperor who built the walls? A tea? Men who bathed in them? Or the unseen hands who lit the fires beneath your feet? You walk on smooth stone, but beneath your feet, fire is fed in silence. The baths of Caracalla, like all great structures in Rome, are not simply monuments to imperial ambition or civic generosity. They are machines, complex, massive, and alive, and like all machines, they require fuel, friction, and unseen hands. You know the surface well by now. The arches, the mosaics, the hot plunge, and cold shock. But very few ever think about what lies below. The Romans called it the hypocaust, literally, fire beneath. And it is more than just a clever word. Beneath the caldarium and tepidarium, a maze of low chambers stretches out like lungs. Raised floors rest on short stone pillars, and in these spaces, hot air is pushed carefully, continuously, from a giant furnace called the Prefernium. Great bronze cauldrons hold the water. Fire heats them. The water is channeled through the bath complex using pipes and gravity. Some of those pipes are made of lead, others clay. The walls themselves are hollowed, creating flues to distribute the heat upward, turning every surface into a slow breath of warmth. But none of this runs without labor, and the men who do that labor are almost never remembered. They are the furnace slaves. No statues are carved for them. No names are etched into stone. They are there every day. They arrive before the sun. They descend through back alleys, narrow doors, and steep staircases. They enter rooms so hot the walls sweat. Their task is simple: keep the fire alive, day and night. No matter the weather, they carry wood, chopped outside the city. It's hauled in by mule carts and feed it into the Prefernium mouth. The flame must stay strong, but not wild. A fire too fierce could crack the stone, too weak, and the water cools. Baths don't run cold. It is a strange kind of captivity. They are slaves, but vital. Exhausted, but invisible, dirty in the surface of cleansing. Each has scars on his hands, burns from mishandled fuel, smudges of soot on skin that will never enter the caldarium. Most of these men will never bathe. Not here. They smell of smoke, not oil, a scrape, carbon from their lungs with coughs. Their reward is placed to sleep near the woodpile, a scrap of bread, a pat on the shoulder from the overseer if the temperature holds. Sometimes one escapes, not to freedom, but to death, a collapse of a tunnel, a fall into the fire trench. The heat is merciless. Above, the bathers sweat in comfort, their muscles relaxing against mosaic walls. Below, the slaves sweat in silence, feeding the heat that makes Roman civility possible. But the fire is only the beginning. The baths require water, massive quantities. Each day, over 1 million liters flow through Caracalla's complex. That water must be clean, cold, hot, pressurized, and predictable. And that, too, requires labor. The engineers, not slaves, but free-born technicians, patrol the aqueducts and valves like priests. These men walk the miles from Aqua Marcia and Aqua Antoniana, adjusting sluices, removing debris, checking pressure. If the water slows, Rome complains. It smells. The Senate hears about it. So they do their jobs with a calm that borders on reverence. Water in Rome is not just infrastructure. It is ideology. The city of empire must flow as reliably as the Tiber. The aqueducts themselves are architectural marvels, raised on stone arches. It's miles long, using nothing but gravity and precision-cut stone. But again, it is the human hands that keep them alive. Men patch leaks with lime mortars, chip away at lime scale inside lead piping, clean algae growth before it fouls the water. Then there are the bath attendants, the capsari. You saw one when you entered. The boy who took your sandals. But for every front-facing capsarius, there are 10 more behind the scenes. Some refill oil bottles, some collect towels, some rub down customers who cannot afford their own slaves. Others sweep the floors between sessions, clear broken glass, and mop spilled wine. One man spends each morning polishing the brass mirrors in the changing rooms. Another is tasked with removing used oil and scraping debris from the stone strigils left behind. There are rules, of course. Bath complexes, while public, are still hierarchical. Wealthier patrons might bring their own attendants. Some even bring guards, though weapons are discouraged. Others arrive with clients, underlings, or favorite wrestlers, parading there, influenced by the number of people trailing behind them. And then there is the marble. It must be cleaned constantly. The Romans love marble, imported from Greece, Egypt, Anatolia. White, green, veined, pink. The more varied the color, the more expensive. But marble is porous. Oil stains it. Blood marks it. Urine splashes in the corners when children run, unsupervised. So each night, a special crew comes with brushes, buckets of vinegar, and linen rags. They kneel on the mosaic floors, scrubbing the sweat of empire from every stone. Some whistle while they work. Others pray. None are paid well. All are replaceable. But if they do their job well, no one notices. That is the strange rule of Roman spectacle. If you're seen, you've failed. The illusion must hold. The baths are not simply for bathing. They are for projecting order, and this order extends even to architecture. The layout of Caracalla is no accident. The massive bath building is nearly symmetrical, designed to guide crowds smoothly from frigidarium to caldarium, and back again. Outside, gardens sprawl in geometric patterns. Statues line walkways. Fountains mask the noise of the city. The entire complex covers over 25 acres. It can hold more than 1,600 bathers at once. Every brick, arch, and chamber is aligned to the cardinal directions. The sun helps heat the rooms in winter, while shaded porticos cool them in summer. This is architecture, not just for utility, but for choreography. You are guided through the space the way a priest guides a ritual. Movement is ritual. Cleanliness is sequence. It's why the baths were open to nearly everyone, poor, rich, soldier, child, because participation reinforced stability. Clean citizens were obedient citizens. Shared sweat replaced shared prayers. Even the rules of conduct were part of the spectacle. You could eat, but not loudly. You could talk, but not shout. You could flirt, but not touch. You could sit in silence, and no one would question your rank until you spoke. And what of women? They had their own schedules. In some complexes, women bathed in the morning, men in the afternoon. In others, separate wings existed. The baths of Caracalla are less documented in this regard, but most historians agree. Roman women did bathe publicly, with rules. They had their own attendants, their own rhythms. For some, it was a break from domestic labor. For others, a chance to socialize, to gossip, to breathe away from the scrutiny of husbands or mothers-in-law. Children often bathed with mothers, but boys over the age of 6 were expected to join the men, and always there was watching. Even in public privacy, the Romans believed in the public body, the idea that your physique reflected your virtue. A strong body was a disciplined mind. A clean body was a loyal citizen. A tanned back, you worked. A scarred arm, you fought. A hunched posture, perhaps a philosopher. Or perhaps a fraud. At the height of their use, the baths of Caracalla were open nearly every day of the year. They closed only for cleaning, repairs, or if the aqueducts failed. In the year 537 CE, they did. The Gothic king Vitiges cut the aqueducts during the siege of Rome. Without water, the baths fell silent. Fires died. The marble cooled. The silence lingered. But long before that, in the height of empire, the baths thrived. Not because of marble, not because of emperors, but because men with scorched hands woke early to light the fires. Because engineers walked the aqueducts barefoot to hear the whispers of water. Because attendants scrubbed until the grout turned white again. Because the civilization decided, quite deliberately, that cleanliness was not private. It was policy. The marble cools slowly. Once, it pulsed with heat and breath. Now, it radiates silence. The baths of Caracalla did not die suddenly. There was no fire, no riot, no decree from a mad emperor. The silence came like fog, creeping in over centuries. If you stood in the caldarium at twilight during the empire's final golden age, you might not have noticed the first signs. The furnaces still roared. The pools still steamed. The brass mirrors still caught the evening sun like sheets of flame. Senators still reclined. Philosophers still argued beside the cold plunge. But something had shifted. Rome was changing, quietly, outside the walls. Pressures grew. Armies thinned. Emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed. Taxes bloated to feed distant wars. Trade routes faltered. The grain ships from Africa began arriving late, or not at all. And yet, the baths remained open, because they had to. They were more than leisure. They were ritual. Each day, they opened with ceremony. The attendants swept the stone. Furnace slaves lit the fires. The engineers whispered to the aqueducts. By noon, the public poured in, and still, the illusion held that Rome was eternal. That order could be bathed into the body like oil into skin. But the strain showed, piece by piece. The statues lost their luster. The fountains ran thin. The tiles cracked and stayed cracked, small. Things easily missed until one day a capsa slipped on algae. The floor hadn't been cleaned well, not because of laziness, but because the vinegar delivery never arrived. A cart was delayed. Supplier had fled during a local rebellion. No one said it out loud, but the bath complex, a city within a city, was no longer self-sufficient. Another day, a marble lion lost its nose. A boy knocked into it. The overseer said it would be fixed by spring. Spring came and went. The lion remained broken. Visitors still came in smaller numbers, with quieter voices. The crowd stand. The laughter faded. The philosophers muttered to themselves. Patrons began to bring their own towels. Oil became expensive. Some used animal fat instead. A few even bathed in silence. No strigils, no oils, just cold water and resignation. And yet, the fires were lit every morning, 'cause it was Rome. Rome did not stop bathing. But the aqueducts, they were a different matter. They stretched for miles, arched spines of the empire, fed by mountain springs, patrolled by engineers who once walked barefoot to listen for leaks. But now, those engineers were gone, drafted, taxed, starved, replaced by lesser men. Sometimes by no one. The Aqua Marcia faltered. The Aqua Antoniana slowed. Cracks appeared in the arches. Barbarians did not need to destroy them. They only needed to ignore them. Nature would do the rest. And in 537 CE, nature was joined by war. The Ostrogoths, in their siege of Rome, cut the aqueducts deliberately, not with malice, but with strategy. Water was life. No aqueducts, no baths, no Rome. For the first time in 300 years, the baths of Caracalla fell silent. No fire was lit that morning. No boy greeted bathers at the door. Caldering cooled. The tepidarium dimmed. Cowed. The water in the cold plunge turned green. The furnace slaves did not arrive. The engineers had already fled. The capsary found other work or died. And yet, even then, the building remained. That was the final trick. Stone outlives steam. Long after the echoes of chatter faded, the baths stood like an empty heart, vast and unbroken. Birds nested in the arches. Vines crept across the domes. Shepherds wandered through the frigidarium, herding goats between marble columns. Children played games beside shattered statues. In the centuries that followed, the baths were pillaged, one block at a time. Columns were stolen for churches. Statues were carted away to private villas. Bricks were harvested for palaces. Bronze was melted down for bells. Yet some pieces resisted. The mosaic floors, too elaborate to pry up quickly, remained in place, cracked, faded, but legible. You can still see them today, swirled of black and white, figures of sea gods, exporters, shaped like waves. They were not designed to be seen alone in silence, but they endure, stubborn as the city they once served. The people who remembered the baths began to die off. A few scribes noted their glory. One monk, writing in the 8th century, called them the work of giants. Another believed they were not Roman at all, but the ruins of a fallen heaven. The scale defied the imagination of later generations. Who could believe such stone was raised for bathing? Even the word lost its meaning. Thermi, once a term of pride, became a riddle. What civilization could afford hot water for the masses? What kind of people would turn cleansing into performance? And yet, the memory lingered, even in decline. The baths left fingerprints on the world. When Charlemagne built Aachen, he mimicked Roman layouts. When Renaissance architects drew their first domes, they studied the ruins of Caracalla. When Michelangelo sculpted his figures, he imagined the bodies that once passed through these marble chambers, oiled, muscled, flawed, and human. In a strange way, the baths never stopped shaping civilization. Even in ruin, they taught scale, they taught symmetry, they taught spectacle, and they taught something else that public life shared. Physical, visible, is a kind of power. The Romans understood that to keep a society coherent, You must give it rhythms, rituals, places to be together. The forum, the theater, the baths, and when those places vanish, not in fire, but in forgetfulness, something begins to fray. Today, the baths of Caracalla are quiet, but not empty. You can walk their ruins. You can follow the footprints of vanished sandals across mosaic paths. You can stand where a furnace once roared. You can touch the walls of the caldarium, still feel the ghost of heat, and you can listen, not for speeches or laughter, but for silence. A silence earned over centuries. A silence that once held steam, oil, and the heartbeat of an empire. And perhaps, if you close your eyes, you will see them. The boys with towels, the philosophers with their hands folded, the old men with sore backs soaking in hot water, the women whispering to each other beneath frescoes, the attendants scraping oil from smooth skin, the furnace slaves coughing in the dark. All of them part of the same breath, the same machine, the same spectacle. A society that believed being clean wasn't private. It was civic. It was Roman. And when the water stopped, Rome changed. There were no togas in the baths, no purple stripes, no golden embroidery, no crested helmets or signet rings, nothing to signal status, except how you carried yourself naked in the public baths of Rome, particularly in the smaller, dimly lit ones tucked behind temples and libraries. Power flowed in whispers, not proclamations. You could not tell a senator from a baker by his robe here, only by how others leaned in when he spoke. This was the real reason many Romans bathed daily, not for hygiene, not even for pleasure, but for access. The baths were, in every sense, an open forum without walls. It began in the apodidium, the changing room, unlike the great halls of Caracalla or Diocletian. These rooms were often modest, square, lined with niches in the wall to hold sandals and tunics. A slave might guard your belongings, or you might simply place your folded clothes beside those of a stranger. No one expected privacy, as the clatter of sandals echoed on the tiled floor. Men greeted each other in the half-light with the kind of familiarity born not of friendship, but of routine. A nod here, a smirk there, an exchanged look that said, "I saw you at the forum. You lost that vote." Words were rarely exchanged in the changing room. Words belonged to the steam. Once, you stripped, you were unranked. A merchant could sit beside a magistrate, a poet beside a general. There was no armor, no brooches to tangle in debate. Just sweat, skin, and the slow unfolding of conversation in the fog. And in that fog, politics of Rome uncoiled themselves like vines. C.A.I.U.S. Suetonius Paulinus, a little-known military tribune before his rise, was said to have secured his first major appointment in a bathhouse. The governor he approached would not meet him at the forum to formal, but agreed to meet in the tepidarium of a small complex near the Aventine Hill, according to a surviving letter fragment. They sat shoulder to shoulder on the warm marble ledge, speaking softly as the steam curled around them. Paulinus offered not bribes, but insights, troop movements, desertions along the Rhine, whispers from Gaul. Information flowed more freely without clothing. The governor listened, leaned closer, and by the next month, Paulinus was reassigned. Higher, richer, and now noticed. These bathhouse meetings became so common that the historian Cassius Dio warned of steam-fogged ambition in his histories. He noted that more appointments were made over steam than scrolls. The water itself became a kind of confidant. You see, in Rome, the bath wasn't a single plunge. It was a ritual of stages, each space shaping how people spoke and listened. The tepidarium, with its mild warmth, was for greetings and gossip. The caldarium, intensely hot and echoing, was for boldness, voices low but statements sharp. And the frigidarium, where bodies cooled and blood surged, was often for silence. And thinking down to Laconicum, the dry sweating room deals were whispered between coughs. He will support the grain vote. Tell your brother not to speak tomorrow. She is sleeping with the quester. Everything was said in passing. Nothing was written. No records. No witnesses. The steam erased the words as soon as they were uttered. Some bathhouses, especially private ones attached to elite villas, were designed with these conversations in mind. Narrow chambers, acoustically dampened with special tiles, allowed secrets to hover just long enough for one listener and no more. Domas owners would build tiny sudatoria sweat rooms, not to sweat, but to speak with those they couldn't be seen with publicly. Exiled senators, wealthy freedmen, foreign envoys. It was said that Julius Caesar himself had a bathhouse on the Palatine Hill with hidden corridors, not for lovers, for informants. Some whispered that Cleopatra met her Roman allies, not in chambers or palaces, beside the hot pools of private Roman baths. The Egyptian queen, known for her theatrical entrances, was said to wear perfume that could be smelled even in the caldarium, jasmine and myrrh trailing behind her like a cloak. Did she speak of alliances, or simply offer glances? Did she threaten, or did she just wait? The baths never recorded, and there were always the watchers. Not everyone came to bathe. Some came to listen. Quiet men, sharp eyes, strained to catch partial phrases between hisses of steam. Slaves were especially useful in this regard. They were everywhere and noticed by no one. Slave drying feet could overhear a coup. A boy handing out towels might remember who left together, didn't return, by the late Republic. Wealthy men began training personal slaves as informants, not just in the house, but in the bath. Slaves, called auricularii, literally, the eared ones, would be taught to remember not words, but patterns. Who met with whom, what days they came, what names were whispered. They did not report to Rome. They reported to men, and men were more dangerous than cities. Women, too, had their spaces, separate bath complexes, or designated hours, and their own networks, though excluded from the formal political sphere. Roman women navigated power in subtler ways. The bathhouses became whisper webs of marriages, dowries, and reputation. A nod in the changing room could unmake a wedding. A rumor started at the Strigil bench might ruin a senator's daughter. Rich women sent their maids ahead, not just to carry oils, but to gather names. Who is bathing today? Could Livia look pale? Is Cornelia's slave bruised again? Every blemish was a message. Every absence was a signal. When Agrippina, the younger, rose to prominence, it was not just her beauty or her bloodline. It was her information. She knew what others did not. Who was aging, who was infertile, lonely, and she used this in ways no decree could match. Even the architecture conspired in these games. Columns were not just supports, they were visual filters. Pools were not just for water, they were stages. Alcoves became confessionals. Echo of water muffled voices in just the right way. And always, someone was watching. Even statues. The Romans loved sculpture, gods, wrestlers, nymphs, but some were strategically placed to hide entrances, to conceal small stairways, to mark who could go where. The gods became part of the theater, and if a god happened to be blindfolded or turned away, it meant this space was for things that should not be seen. Not all plots in the baths were noble. Murder happened. 2. One early imperial account tells of a freedman named Denter who drowned during a cold plunge. Witnesses claimed he slipped, but a week later his rival, who had previously been barred from bidding on a shipping contract, acquired that very route. No trial, no questions. A silent death in water left no wounds. The baths were dangerous, not because they were violent, but because they were quiet. And yet, ordinary people bathed alongside the powerful. Fathers brought sons. Merchants brought partners. Poets recited verses in the open air after oiling their backs. Musicians played flutes in the tepidarium corners. The politics passed overhead like distant thunder, never quite touching the stone beneath their feet. But even they knew what baths were alive. Everything breathed here, not just the steam, but the city's very soul. And if you listened closely, beneath the sound of dripping water and metal scraping skin, you could hear the gears of history turning. Not loudly, just enough, just enough. The caldarium steamed with more than water. It steamed with the sweat of ambition. When the marble floors were slick, the walls ran wet with condensation. Proximity mattered more than persuasion. One didn't shout to be heard. Sid sat close, very close, close enough that the hairs on arms might brush, close enough that a whisper would carry, even if the room was full. In Roman politics, the most critical thing wasn't always money or bloodline. It was access. In the bathhouses, those echoing, mist-draped temples of shared silence were where that access was granted or denied. Not everyone could afford to spend their afternoons in the thermae, but those who could learned how to wield them like a second forum. There were entire hierarchies based on arrival time alone. Early bathers were seen as ambitious or desperate. Late bathers, arriving during the cool, golden haze of late afternoon, often held higher rank. Those who could afford to loiter were those who had already won. A young man, hoping to be noticed, didn't speak loudly. He didn't boast. He simply positioned himself within the warm corridor between the apodium and the caldarium, the place where elder magistrates, tired from heat, paused to catch their breath. Standing there, oil flask in hand, towel over one shoulder, he waited. Not for words, for glances. If a man of influence looked twice, even if just to ask for a towel or a bit of oil, the younger man had succeeded. He was no longer invisible. Power was sticky in steam, clung to people if you stood near it long enough. Some of it remained on you. This wasn't just metaphor. It was how patronage worked. Patrons older, established men cultivated their clientes, not only in the Senate or on the streets, but here in the baths. A nod of recognition from a patron inside the tepidarium was often more meaningful than an introduction in public. The bath allowed for casual acquaintance. And casualness, paradoxically, created loyalty. A patron might call a younger man over to scrub his back, a task that was oddly intimate, yet unremarkable. But in that moment, he might murmur, "I hear your uncle left you some vineyards. Your brother writes well. Tell him to bring his verses tomorrow. You've met Flaccus, haven't you?" "No, I'll have him join us." Teas weren't favors. Not yet. They were possibilities, scattered like rose petals in warm water. The placement of bodies in the baths became a kind of choreography. Some corners were louder than others. Some benches were known to be hot, politically, not just thermally. If you sat near the third arch in the caldarium, as close to the small statue of Venus pouring water from her jar, you were signaling your desire to be seen. If you sat by the far wall, beneath the vent where the heat was sharpest and few dared linger, you signaled that you wanted privacy. Or power.men learned to read the room not by what was said, but by where it was said. And yet, for all its choreography, the bathhouse was a place of accidents. One of the most famous such accidents happened in 33 BCE. Marcus Agrippa, close ally of Augustus, had built new public baths near the Pantheon. They were elegant, open, adorned with brass mirrors and lion-headed fountains. One day, he arrived to find a young man blocking the apoditorium entrance with his sandals, drying himself slowly, taking up space without seeming to notice. Agrippa, known for both military discipline and urban generosity, said nothing. He waited. The young man, Lucius Norbanus, looked up, startled. He apologized, moved quickly, and offered his towel. Agrippa declined, entered, and thought little of it. But the next day, Norbanus was there again, quieter this time, quicker, to move, more careful, and again the day after. By the fourth day, Agrippa asked his name. By the seventh, he invited him to sit beside him in the tepidarium. 2 years later, Norbanus was made quaestor. 4 years later, he was offered a governorship in Hispania. This was how fates change, not with fanfare, with foot placement. Of course, the bath could also ruin a man might speak too freely, lulled by warmth and the illusion of privacy. He might mock a magistrate, thinking no one could hear. But someone always did. A freedman, a slave, a boy delivering oils. The walls themselves seemed to remember. It was said that a joke about Tiberius, made lightly by a minor poet in the steam, reached the emperor's ears within 2 days. The poet was never seen again. His name was erased from festival rolls. His verses remained, but no one claimed to have heard them. Eunuchs played a curious role in this ecosystem. Off in attendance, in private bath suites, they moved between classes like smoke. Neither man nor woman in the Roman legal sense. Eunuchs were trusted to serve women, guard wealth, and occasionally deliver messages between powerful men. A eunuch might spend hours tending to an old noble in the caldarium, only to slip away during the cool down and whisper a summary to another man waiting outside. They weren't spies, they were bridges, and like bridges, they were walked over, but always remembered. By the early 2nd century CE, emperors themselves began to use bathhouses as instruments of soft governance. Trajan, for example, was said to wander his public baths on feast days, not in disguise, but as himself, listening to complaints, compliments, and laughter. He made few decrees, but many decisions. Hadrian, on the other hand, preferred quiet, private baths. His inner circle included architects, poets, and astrologers, all men he first conversed with in the warmth of the steam. He considered the caldarium a place of clarity. The mind is cleanest where the skin is bare, he once wrote in a lost letter quoted by the Historia Augusta. Bathhouses came satellites of the palace, places where imperial favor could be glimpsed, if not grasped, women in their own spheres were no less strategic. In the baths of wealthy neighborhoods, where noble women bathed under mosaic ceilings, social wars unfolded with the clink of bracelets and the whisper of olive oil bottles. A glance could unseat a marriage, compliment about one's perfume could signal an alliance, and a cold shoulder, literal or metaphorical, could echo louder than a Senate speech. Slave girls attended their mistresses with eyes downcast but ears wide open. Gossip passed from chamber to chamber like water over tile. The time a noblewoman dried her hair in the sun-drenched courtyard, she might know who was expecting, who was mourning, and who had received a letter from a general abroad. One story tells of Julia Balbina, rich widow with no sons, who found her heir not through family but through the baths. C noticed a young girl, modest but confident, who helped a blind elder woman bathe without being asked. Julia inquired. The girl was a niece of her husband's former steward. Within a month, Julia adopted her. The bath saw things the courts ignored, and finally, through the scriptors, vapory, the steam scribes. They were unofficial, unacknowledged, but they existed. Young men, often poor and sharp-eyed, who made a quiet living remembering things. They lingered near the benches. They observed who came and went. They memorized who laughed with whom. At night, they wrote lists, names, faces, patterns, and when the time was right, they sold what they knew. Not in scrolls, not in ink, just whispered, slowly, in the dark corner of a tavern, or over a cup of sour wine, or while fanning a tired senator who couldn't remember why the grain shipments had slowed, but needed someone who did. In ancient Rome, the bathhouse was never just about water. It was about proximity, about the choreography of glances and gestures, about who sat beside whom, about who helped dry your back, about who stayed too long, about who left early. The bath was not a sanctuary from politics. It was politics. Wet, wrinkled, whispered politics. Politics. The air in a Roman bathhouse was more than air. It was memory, folded into steam. It carried not just moisture, but mood. Those who entered the caldarium in silence rarely left unchanged. The weight of the place to stone, the heat, the collective breath of 100 strangers pressed against the chest. And when the water rippled, it seemed to ripple with more than temperature. It rippled with emotion. Some said it was the closest a Roman ever came to feeling the presence of the divine, or the dead. Even after centuries of reuse, renovation, and repurposing, some bathhouses kept reputations they never lost. Not because of what had been built there, but because of what had been felt. The baths of Caracalla. Grand and imperial for the architectural majesty of power, but not necessarily peace. Their height inspired awe, but also dread. The ceilings were so tall, so arched, that the echoes often seemed like whispers from far above. Voices returned, distorted. Laughter lingered in the dome long after the speaker had fallen quiet. Visitors spoke of moments when they turned their heads, sharply certain they'd heard someone just behind them, but found no one, not even a slave, not even a breeze. This wasn't superstition. This was atmosphere. Even the most rational Romans believed that certain places retained impressions. Not ghosts, exactly, but emotional fingerprints. If a murder had occurred in a room, that room remembered. If a man had wept in the corner of the frigidarium, others might later feel chilled there, even if the water was warm. If two lovers had parted beside the basins, the air around that stone could feel heavier. Long after their names were forgotten, one freedwoman wrote in a wax tablet diary discovered centuries later, "There is a bench in the women's tepidarium I will not sit upon. When I sat there last, I dreamed of my son and awoke with my hands clenched and heart racing. The bench was smooth, but something beneath it moved." Architecture, of course, played its part. The acoustics of the domes weren't accidental. Roman engineers understood resonance. They could tune a room like an instrument. A whisper at the far end of the apodarium could be heard clearly at the entrance. The angle of the arch was correct. Some said this was for surveillance. Others said it was for poetry. Regardless of intent, the effect was emotional. Voices blurred, footsteps amplified. A single splash could sound like a wave, and in the silence that followed, even a yawn felt intimate. Then came the scent. Each bathhouse had its own olfactory signature, its own mixture of oil, sweat, clay, wood smoke, and perfume. Some noble baths favored spikenard, a musky root imported from India, thick and lingering. Others used Egyptian myrrh, sweet and slightly bitter, meant to purify not just the body, but the spirit. Poorer districts used olive oil mixed with thyme or laurel. The scent clung to towels and hair and skin for hours afterward, creating an invisible trail as bathers returned to their homes. But scent wasn't just decoration. It was language. A woman who wore cinnamon to the baths signaled fertility and desire. A man who oiled himself with rosewater instead of cedar might be mourning. A girl who arrived with no scent at all, even after bathing, might be declaring her poverty, her protest. One story tells of a young bride-to-be named Fadia who wore no perfume for 3 days before her wedding. It was a silent signal to her mother-in-law who had mocked her dowry. On the 4th day, Fadia bathed in lavender and cassia. On the 5th, her husband's family doubled her gold. The bathhouse remembered. Some spoke of places within the baths that were neither warm nor cold, spaces where the air seemed to hang, in defiance of the laws of heat. In the baths of Titus, near a drain in the northeast chamber, the air never steamed, even on feast days. The stone beneath remained cool, but a small mosaic there depicting a dolphin and two eagles, was thought to be cursed. No one stepped directly on it, not even the slaves. It was said that a woman once did, perhaps on a dare. She died 2 days later of a fever no physician could explain. Was it true? Probably not. But the mosaic remained untouched for 200 years. There were other mysteries, quieter ones. Some bathhouses had rooms for silence, not meditation as we think of it today, but silence as a rite. A visitor would pay extra to enter. Inside was nothing but stone. No benches, no water, just shadow and heat and quiet. These rooms were often small, no more than 10 feet wide. Yet they held more weight than the CALDAR. In these rooms, women wept without explanation. Men knelt without shame. Eunuchs sang softly to themselves, in voices only the walls heard. One inscription found scratched into the wall of such a chamber reads, "I left my grief here. May the next who enters carry it one day longer, and then let it go." There is a story, likely myth, of a Roman general who entered the baths of Neptune after 20 years of war. He had lost brothers, soldiers, sleep, and purpose. He sat in the steam for 3 hours, UNMOVING. When an attendant came to check on him, the general whispered, "I cannot feel my hands, not from the heat, but from the silence." And then he wept, not from pain, not from shame, but because he had finally heard something he'd forgotten, the sound of nothing. Even slaves felt it. They worked the fires, hauled the water, scraped the oil, and yet they too noticed when a bathhouse felt different. Some nights, when the furnace fires burned too hot, they swore the walls pulsed, like lungs, or like memory. A few said they saw shadows move against the mosaic ceilings when no one else was inside. An old stoker named Russo, whose story was scratched into the wall of the baths of Decimus, once wrote, "The bath is not made of stone. It is made of men's breath and secrets. Every night I clean their footprints, but in the morning new ones appear, feet smaller than any man's feet, that drip no water. I do not speak of this, but I do not sleep." It's not all believed these tales. Rational senators laughed. Stoic philosophers dismissed them. But those who lived among the walls, who tended the baths through seasons and rains, nodded silently. They didn't claim ghosts. And when a bathhouse closed, when the stones finally cracked, and the mosaics faded, those who remembered did not say the bath was destroyed. 8. They said the bath had exhaled its last breath, because a bath was never just marble. It was mood. It was memory. It was the breath of thousands gathered in silence and released in warmth, a sacred forgetting, a quiet witnessing, a place where history was not recorded, but dissolved. The Nile had crested that summer, and the air above Thebes was heavy with slow breezes and the smell of wet reeds. In the poorer quarters behind the Temple of Mud, where chickens picked at dust and plaster peeled from mud brick homes, a woman leaned into the wall of her dwelling and breathed out short, trembling gasps. Her eyes were closed. Her fingers dug into the linen sheet spread beneath her feet. A gnarled hand stroked her back with a calm repetition. The hand belonged to the midwife, and the midwife was everything in ancient Egypt. Births didn't happen in temples or clinics. They happened in kitchens, in animal sheds, in dark back rooms where privacy was borrowed from silence and ritual. A laboring woman was surrounded not by doctors, but by other women, mostly older, mostly discreet, mostly nameless. And at the center of this circle stood the midwife. She held no scroll of credentials. She had no formal title beyond the phrase, Renet, Pare, M, Kemet, she who delivers in darkness. And yet she was vital, indispensable, and feared, because childbirth in ancient Egypt was not a celebration. It was a crossing. It's 'cause called very wrong. The woman in labor tonight was named Tia. She had delivered once before stillborn. She was young, just 17, and already weathered by the Nile's rhythms, the rise, the fall, the hunger when floods came late, the sickness when they came too early. Her husband worked at a pottery kiln. He did not speak much, and tonight he had chosen to stay outside. Pacing the alleyway with a cracked jug of beer inside, Tia squatted on a birth brick. A real, one carved, painted, an heirloom passed from woman to woman for over 3 generations. The brick was old, but sound. One side bore a figure of Hathor, arms raised, eyes wide, flanked by cows, the goddess of music and joy, the goddess of motherhood. Tia did not look at the brick. She looked at the midwife. The midwife's name was Nebeta. She had delivered 83 children. She had lost 20-9, and she remembered every single one. She was not a priestess. She had never entered the court of the pharaoh, but among the women of the lower quarter, her name carried weight. Girls whispered it when their bellies grew tight. Mothers saved scraps of linen or amulets to offer in exchange for her presence. And when she arrived, usually barefoot, always silent, she brought with her a woven basket of strange contents. Inside were clay figurines, bits of palm frond, polished stones, a few dried lotus petals, a worn knife, and a copper spoon. Most of all, she brought time, hours of it. Patience wrapped in ritual. Nebeta had no husband. She had no children. She had once tried, but that story had ended before it began, and she never told it again. Tonight, the room was lit by a single oil lamp. Its flame was shaped by the wind thin and bowed like a reed. The air smelled of myrrh and fear. Nebeta leaned close to Tia's ear and whispered a prayer, not in the language of scribes or priests, but in the private tongue of women, soft, rhythmic, and nearly forgotten. Let the path open. Let the way widen. Let the water break and carry life. The floor was covered in sand and linen. There was no ceremony, only a rhythm, moan, pause, breath. Moan, pause, breath. Outside, a lizard scrambled across the roof. A clay pot cracked in the killyard. But inside, the world had narrowed to 2 people, one trying to enter it, the other trying to let it pass. In ancient Egypt, the midwife did more than catch babies. She read omens in the blood. She judged the tension of the uterus like a baker testing dough. She muttered spells, not for show, not to impress, but to steady herself to claim a thread of control in a moment ruled by chaos. And there was so much chaos in childbirth. For all the ancient Egyptians' reverence for life and order math, there was little they could do in the face of a breech birth, a hemorrhage, a twisted cord. There were no surgical tools, no antiseptic, no second chances. A midwife's only weapons were instinct, pressure, and prayer. The texts we find today speak little of midwives. They appear only in shadows, in fragments of papyri where the medical meets the magical. One such fragment, discovered in Deir el-Medina, reads, "Take honey and natron, mix with crocodile dung, apply to the birth brick to summon the child swiftly." Another, more sobering, simply says, "If the child does not cry, place milk upon the mother's breast and seal the doorway. The spirit must not escape." These were not hospital instructions. These were survival chants. Tia cried out again. Her hands clutched Nebeta's wrists, and the old woman did not pull away. She let the girl squeeze, let her nails draw blood. The head was coming. Slowly, slowly, there was a tearing, not just of skin, but of time, of identity. A girl became a vessel became a mother. Or not. The oil lamp flickered. Nebeta reached into the heat and pulled. And then, a cry. Sharp, wet, animal, alive. Tia did not speak. Her eyes stared, unfocused. Her mouth moved, but no sound came. Nabetta placed the child, glistening, furious against Tia's chest, and whispered, "It is a girl. No celebration. It's just a truth." In Egypt, girl children were not discarded, as in some other ancient cultures, but they were rarely celebrated. With feasts, daughters became wives, servants, scribes, if lucky, midwives, if braver still. The room was silent again, except for the child's mewling. Nabetta tied the cord with linen thread soaked in wine. She anointed the baby's forehead with oil. Then, she dipped a lotus petal in water and touched it to the girl's lips. The ancient ritual for blessing breath. Outside, the husband remained. In the alley, he did not enter. He would be told in the morning when the risk of death had passed. Nabetta sat back on her heels. Her hands trembled, not from fatigue. From memory, 80 for now. She had done this 84 times, and each time it felt less like a task and more like a mystery. She looked at Tia, at the girl's pale skin, the hollowed cheeks, the trembling lips. She looked at the newborn, already suckling in fitful pools, and she thought not for the first time how strange it was to bring life into a world so indifferent to it. Later, when the sun began to rise and the Nile turned from black to blue, Nabetta would walk home with the basket under her arm. She would wash her hands with natron. She would light incense. She would write a single line in the margin of her reed scroll. Tia, girl, full moon, no complications. She would not record the scream, the blood, the way Tia had clung to her, like a sister or a ghost. Some things were not meant for papyrus, but even in silence, the work left its trace, not in statues or stone, but in women who woke to nurse at dawn, in babies who would live to become scribes, servants, or mothers themselves. This was the midwife's oath, to deliver without witness, to save without praise, to remember without inscription. And tonight, in a back alley in Thebes, she had kept it again. But would she keep it next time? Would her aging hands still know when to push and when to wait? Would the gods still listen? Or had they grown tired of these small, mortal rituals? Nabetta did not sleep the night after the birth. She returned to her small home just before sunrise, sandals damp with dew and her knees stiff from kneeling. The sky over Thebes had begun to fade from indigo to gray, and the first birds, small, jittery things with dusty wings, whistled among the reeds. Smoke curled up from cooking fires. Life went on, but Nabetta did not rest. Instead, she sat beside her shelf of jars, some sealed with wax, others with linen or carved stoppers, and began her careful inventory. Each jar held a mixture she had made by hand: honey steeped in thyme, powdered frankincense, quished barley mixed with ground copper, dried herbs ground on a smooth basalt slab. Nothing written down, memory and feel. There was no formal Egyptian midwifery school, no scrolls of standard practice, no stone edicts dictating what to do when the womb tore or the child turned. For midwives like Nabetta carried generations of trial and ritual in their heads. They observed, pid, they remembered, and they shared secrets only with those who had earned them through pain, patience, and blood. On her reed mat, Nabetta placed 3 small objects. The first, a wax figurine of Torotai, the hippo-headed goddess of childbirth, wit, pendulous, breasts, thick limbs, and the snarling mouth of a beast. She was protector of the pregnant, the one who stood at the edge of labor and roared at demons. The second, a looped amulet of carnelian, orange red, worn smooth by years of sweat and clutching. She always placed this under the mother's pillow after delivery. The third, a flat piece of linen soaked in wine, dried and folded. This she would burn later as a quiet offering. The linen had been used to wipe the newborn's mouth. Fire, she believed, took pain away from the earth. These were not hospital tools. But they had power. And in ancient Egypt, power lived in the invisible things: breath, heat, spirit, sound. When a baby was born, the real work had only just begun. The mother was still vulnerable, open in every sense. The womb had emptied, but not closed. Blood could continue for days. Fever could strike by the second moon. Milk might not come, and if it did, it might sour. The child might fail to latch, might fall silent in the night. The midwife stayed for days, sometimes weeks, returning each morning with her basket. She watched, she listened to the baby's cry. She touched the mother's belly with slow fingers, feeling for hardening or softness. She sniffed sweat. She held cloth to the woman's mouth and asked her to breathe on it. A scent of rot meant danger. There were no thermometers, no lab tests, but there was attention. And attention, Nabetta believed, could save lives. There was a ritual on the third day. If the baby had lived, the mother had not bled out, Nabetta would take the child out into the light. Not to the courtyard, no, never so public, but to the edge of the roof. Just as the sun crested the eastern horizon, the child would be wrapped in fine linen, not new, but clean and held aloft, just slightly, just enough that the morning light could touch the skin. This wasn't for the gods, it was for the flies. If the child did not squirm at the bite of gnats or the sting of dust, something was wrong. The Nile wind had to touch the lungs. The child had to sneeze, had to blink, had to cry. If not, the mother would be told the child was weak, not cursed, not broken, just ... not strong enough. And sometimes the baby would not return inside. Nabetta had once kept a tally. She used a reed stylus and marked notches into a broken piece of faience tile. One mark for each birth, a second for each survival past the third day, a final mark, faint and crossed, for each child lost after that. Eventually, the tile cracked. She threw it into the Nile. Now she counted only in her head, and sometimes in dreams. Tia's baby had lived. She was named Becket, servant of the goddess. It was a common name, a safe name, and Nabetta approved. Names were not meant to tempt fate. No mother should name a daughter Gift of Ra or Queen of the River unless she was ready to see that child taken. Becket was healthy. Her legs kicked with surprising force. She latched well. Her eyes were black and wide, and she seemed constantly to squint, as if the world displeased her. But Tia had grown quiet. She fed the baby. She held her. She even smiled. But her eyes stayed distant. Her answers were short. Her body healed slowly. Nabetta knew the signs. She had seen them before. The body might recover, but the soul could stay torn in Egyptian medicine. Physical healing was just one part of survival. The Kie, or life force, had to be nourished. The Ba, or personality, had to be comforted at death. A mother's cow was weakened. She might not bond with her child. The milk might spoil. The home might fill with silence. To restore balance, Nabetta prepared a treatment. She ground juniper berries with dried date pits and brewed them in warm beer. She soaked a length of woven palm fiber in the mixture, let it dry, and tied it around Tia's wrist. The scent was sharp, bitter, but it stirred. Something made the mother blink and look up. That was enough. Not a cure, but a start. It was during this time that another woman appeared. Her name was Neferet. She wore sandals with gold-painted straps, and her hair had been braided with crushed malachite dust. She smelled of incense and money. She was the wife of a scribe, and she was 6 months pregnant. "I want your hands," she said, lifting her chin. "When the time comes." Nabetta looked her over slowly. "You will not want my hands," she said, but she knew the truth. Neferet would come anyway. When her servants grew useless, when her paid priestess disappeared, when the baby came too early or too late, Nefret would remember this conversation, and she would come. And Nebeta would not refuse. A midwife could not choose who suffered. At the temple, male physicians wrote of childbirth in distant, detached tones. They listed ingredients for potions, diagrams of wombs drawn like irrigation ditches. They spoke of remedies using crocodile dung and donkey milk. But they did not deliver children. They did not kneel in blood. They did not hear a mother whisper, "Take the child if I do not wake." Only women heard that, and they carried it. There were stories told among midwives of a labor that lasted 3 days until the baby emerged, covered in fine white hair, and did not breathe. Of a woman who bled until her eyes turned gray. Of a child, born with a second row of teeth, declared a bad omen, drowned by the village priest before its mother woke. Some stories were too terrible to speak. Others were repeated to pass the hours. But Nebeta held one story closest. She had once been a mother. Many years ago, so many that her own bones could not count each. She had given birth alone, in the dark, before she knew what birth required. She had done everything wrong, and her baby, small and still and beautiful, had made no sound. She had buried it with her own hands, and that was when she began, not to forget, but to redeem. Each child she delivered was not a replacement, but a promise that she would never again leave a woman to deliver alone. By the 10th day, Tia's bleeding had stopped. Her appetite had returned. Beckett had grown fatter. She grasped at fingers and gurgled at shadows. Nebeta prepared to leave. She packed her basket. She tied her tunic. She wiped the lint from her shawl and placed the wax figurine of Tourette back in its pouch. As she turned to go, Tia took her hand. "Will you come again?" she asked. Nebeta paused. "If the goddess calls me," she said. Tia did not understand, but she nodded, and Nebeta left the house silently, her sandals quiet on the dust. She did not look back. Outside, the Nile wind stirred. A newborn cried. A mother breathed, and the midwife's shadow stretched long behind her. She would be needed. Again, she always was. But for now, she walked alone, an old woman with a basket full of gods, herbs, and quiet knowledge. And that, in ancient Egypt, was enough. The city of Thebes never fully slept, not even in the hours before dawn. Where always a pot was being scrubbed, a prayer murmured, a reed mat shaken out onto the street. But on the 12th day after Beckett's birth, the air was unusually still. Jackals howled. No sandals echoed in the alleys. Even the wind off the Nile seemed to hold its breath. Nebeta awoke without knowing why. She lay on her side, her body stiff and uncooperative, her knees curled toward her chest. The clay lamp beside her had gone cold. A single fly circled above her forehead, persistent, annoying. He batted it away. Then came the knock dot 3 times, slow, firm, not the frantic thump of a panicked father or the shouts of a maid in labor. Just 3 knocks, measured, controlled. Nebeta knew what that meant. Someone important was asking. She sat up slowly, her spine cracking in protest. She poured water into a basin and washed her face, then pulled her oldest robe over her shoulders. It smelled of oil and old linen and the faint sweetness of ground fenugreek. When she opened the door, a young man stood there, barefoot and trembling. "Lady Nefret," he said, voice quivering. "She bleeds. The baby won't come." Nebeta didn't ask questions. She didn't sigh. She didn't pray. She simply nodded, gathered her basket, and followed. The house of Nefret was nothing like Tia's. It was broad and quiet and tasted of cool stone. The windows had shutters carved with lotus blossoms. The floors were rubbed smooth with powdered sand. Painted columns supported the inner courtyard, where fat geese waddled near a fountain. But that night, everything felt brittle. The fountain was dry. The lamps had burned low, and somewhere above them, a woman screamed. Nabetta walked past a line of servants who looked down as she passed. They offered no food, no greeting, not even water for her cracked lips. That was fine. She did not come for courtesy. In the birthing room, Nefret lay with her knees drawn up, sweat pouring down her temples. Her eyes wild. A priestess stood beside her, muttering prayers and clutching a papyrus scroll smeared with oil. Nabetta ignored her. The floor was clean, too clean. The air held the sharp sting of cedar resin, not the deep, warm smells of a home in labor. The women around the bed held towels, but not experience. Their fingers trembled. One of them wept softly. "You've had contractions since when?" Nabetta asked, her voice soft, low. "Since morning." Nefret's voice was hoarse. "It hurts. The baby doesn't move anymore." That was all Nabetta needed to hear. She pressed her hands gently to the swollen belly, then lower. Her touch was not gentle, not now. She felt for the baby's position. Wrong. Sideways. The shoulders lodged. The head tilted. Would not come out on its own. She closed her eyes. This was not a delivery. This was a rescue. Nabetta called for silence. She motioned for the priestess to leave. The priestess refused. Nabetta pointed at the scroll in her hand. "If your gods can pull a child through bone," she said flatly, "I'll stay quiet. Otherwise, leave." The priestess left, and the room became a place of breath and pain. Nefret whimpered, then screamed. She clawed at the cushions beneath her. Her husband was nowhere in sight. Her sisters watched from the doorway, one with a cloth pressed to her mouth. Nabetta poured warm oil into her hands. She murmured not to the gods, but to the baby. Not words of magic, but rhythm beat.com. A whisper between souls. Come down. Turn your head. Let go. Her fingers reached deep. She found the tiny arm. Too stiff. The shoulder was jammed. She rotated, gently, slowly, pulling the arm across the chest, easing the turn. The room darkened at the edges. Time bent, then a push, then a gush of blood, then silence. The child slid out, limp and blue. Nabetta did not announce a death. She wrapped the baby in linen and placed it in a shallow basket near the wall. Then she returned to the mother. Nefret's pulse was faint. Her skin had turned a strange color, gray, like ash. Her breathing was shallow. Her womb had not contracted. She was bleeding more than she should have. Nabetta packed linens against the flow. She fed her a tincture of pomegranate bark and myrrh. She lit a sprig of desert thyme near her feet. And she waited. She waited while the servants whispered, while the sisters wrung their hands, while the priestess from the hall began to chant again. By sunrise, the bleeding had slowed. Nefret's fingers moved. She was not well, but she would live. Nabetta carried the small basket down to the banks of the Nile. She walked alone. No mourning family, no crying father. Just her and the bundle. This was not the first stillbirth she had carried to the river. It would not be the last. In Egypt, death and birth were siblings. One could not exist without the other. She knelt by the reeds and whispered words only she had heard before. "You did your best. You are not forgotten." Then she placed the basket on the water. The Nile accepted it, as it had so many others. No splash, no noise, just drifting. When she returned home, she did not weep. Instead, she took out a new piece of linen. She soaked it in beer mixed with henna and tamarisk. She hung it in the doorway of her home. It was a sign to others, a sign that said, "The work continues." But not today. And that was her version of grief. The day passed slowly. She sat in her garden and ground dried blue lotus into powder. She tended to a swollen finger. She sewed up the seam in her robe. She watched ants carry a crumb of barley across a crack in the stone. Nothing urgent, nothing miraculous, just the world continuing, indifferent. That evening, someone else knocked. This Time. It was a young girl, barely 12, sent from a weaver's house down the road. My sister is having her first, the girl said nervously. There's no one else. Nabetta stood, bones groaning. She did not ask for payment. She did not ask for time. She only packed her basket again. The same wax figure of Tauret, same carnelian amulet, same faith that hands and time could save lives. She tied her shawl and stepped to the night. The world would keep needing her, and she would keep answering in ancient Egypt. Most midwives had no names recorded, no statues, no tombs, but their work remained in the bones of those who lived. And sometimes that was the only monument that mattered. The land had not always been still. There was a time, not long ago, when the Nile forgot its boundaries, when its waters rose faster than prayers could be spoken, when it did not trickle or flow, but swallowed homes, grain, people, even the voices of the priests. This story begins just after the swallowing, after the brown water receded, leaving behind a thin crust of silt on every surface, after the priests declared the gods had made their will known, after the scribes had counted the bodies, and after most people had moved on. But she had not moved on. She still lived by the river's edge, in a house rebuilt of old mud brick and broken intentions. Her name was Hipot, though few used it now. Most called her simply the widow, a name both respectful and dismissive, like she were a living remnant of something already buried. Her husband, Tefnacht, had been a boatman. He ferried dates and baskets of grain between the granaries of Pyramises in the fields just north of Mendes. A strong man, a gentle one, and his hands were always caked with rope dust and palm oil. His sandals bore the mark of every shoreline in Lower Egypt. He had been the first to drown. That had been 4 years ago. Or maybe 5. Hepit no longer counted. Some mornings she marked the passing of time by the weight of mold on her date jars. Some evenings by the slow angle of sunlight slipping across the broken tile of the courtyard. It was not loneliness that pressed in on her. It was memory, not in the form of flashbacks or grief, but in the practical way of the old. A footpath worn deep by repetition. A table that still had room for 2. A jug refilled out of habit. And, above all, the smell of river mud, always clinging to the soles of her feet like an unspoken name. Pyramises had once been magnificent. The city of Ramses, the great stone colonnades, gold-tipped obelisks, gardens where white lilies bloomed in symmetrical ponds. There had been processions once, trumpets, incense, the flicker of blue-glazed tiles under noonlight. Now the city was quieter, not dead, just settled, like dust in the folds of an old linen. Merchants still shouted from behind their stalls. Temple boys still ran barefoot with baskets of barley loaves. And the priests of Amun still chanted every 6th day, their voices echoing through halls that had not been repaired in a generation. But the flood had left its signature, a fine line of desolation, watermark against the stone. In the quarter where the laborers had lived, where Hepit still lived, the houses bore scars, salt rising through walls, cracks widening just slightly each month. Some rooftops caved in entirely, becoming homes for birds and stray cats. People left them standing anyway. To tear them down would be to admit something final. And in Egypt, finality belonged to the gods. Hepit's life followed a strict pattern now, like the weaving of a basket. She rose before the second cockcrow. She fed the pigeons from her late husband's coop. Most had flown away after the flood, but a few remained thin, loyal creatures with ragged feathers. She scattered barley on the flat roof where the water line still showed, like a brown necklace around the house. Then she boiled water with fennel root and drank it alone. Sometimes she walked to the river's edge, not because she hoped to see, Tefnakht. Rise from it. She had long given up on dreams, but because it reminded her that some things still moved without her permission, the Nile shimmered with slow, lazy conviction, always flowing, never rushing, the same way her husband had spoken. And then she cleaned. She cleaned everything, even things that did not need it. The floor, the edges of her single oil lamp, the space between the bricks of her threshold, scrubbed with salt and vinegar. She washed every bowl as though it were to be used for a sacred offering. It gave her something to do with her hands, and hands, after loss, are often wiser than the heart. The neighbors did not speak ill of her. They simply stopped speaking much, at all. Not out of cruelty, that was not the Egyptian way, but out of that deep, comfortable reverence that people reserve for those who suffered a great deal and continued on anyway. They feared touching what grief had made sacred. Children were told not to disturb her. She was said to talk to the river, to cook for two, to sleep with a knife under her pillow, safeguarding someone still breathing. These were not accusations. They were observations, whispers, the kind that trail behind someone like a second, visible robe. Hepit knew what was said, and she did not mind. She had no use for conversation anymore. What she had instead was time and memory. Always memory. One morning, as the date palms began to shed their yellow flowers, a boy arrived at her door. He was no more than 7, barefoot and freckled, with a scroll tucked under one arm and a chipped wooden tablet in the other. He introduced himself with a bow so deep his curls touched his knees. "My name is Baby," he said quickly. "My uncle says you know how to write." Hepa looked at the scroll, then at him. "Your uncle is a liar," she said, turning back toward her door. "No," the boy said. "Shh." He said, "You used to copy temple records before you were married. Shh. That you were a scribe's daughter." She paused. That had been true once. Her father had trained scribes in a small court not far from the old capital. She had learned to shape hieratic symbols with a reed pen, while other girls her age were learning to grind ochre. She had written lists, tax inventories, ceremonial oaths, marriage contracts. She had not touched a stylus in over 2 decades. But something about the boy's face stopped her. Not the hope in his eyes, but the way he held the tablet, as though it was something heavy, and not because of its weight. "What do you need written?" she asked. He held up the scroll. "A name," he said simply. "My mother's name, for the House of Life." The House of Life was the temple archive, the place where names were recorded for eternity. It was believed that if a name was inscribed there, the person's soul would never fully vanish. It would be remembered by the gods. Bibi's mother had died in the flood. Her name had never been recorded. It was not uncommon. The city had buried more people than it had time to document. Whole families had been placed in the sands beyond the city's edge with nothing but a prayer and a scrap of cloth. And so this boy, this quiet, barefoot boy, had come to her because someone had told him the widow remembered how to write. She invited him in. She unrolled the scroll, examined the temple's stamped header, and prepared a reed pen. She ground the ink herself, soot mixed with gum and a trace of beer. Her hand trembled only slightly as she dipped the brush. "What was her name?" she asked. "Setka," he said, "daughter of Menes, weaver of blue thread." She smiled. It was a beautiful name. She began to write. The brush moved slowly, confidently, like the muscles remembered before the mind did. Each stroke was a breath, each curve of the character an offering. When she finished, the name gleamed softly in the light. She handed it to the boy. "Take it to the temple steward," she said. "Tell him Hepit of Parameses bore witness." He bowed again, his eyes wet, but not from sadness, from relief, and he left. That night, Teapot lit 2 oil lamps, not because she was expecting anyone, but because she remembered what it was like to be needed. Some say grief is a hole. But in Hepat's house, it became a bridge between one life and another. And sometimes, all it takes to rebuild that bridge is a single name written in ink. After the boy left, Hepat sat in silence for a long time. Not the kind of silence that comes from absence, but the kind that gently fills a room like flower dust in morning light. It clung to the clay walls, settled on her woven mat, wrapped itself around the edge of her tunic. And in that silence, she watched the tip of her reed pen darken. Slowly, in the last of the ink, something had shifted. She had expected the boy to forget her, to vanish into the city's alleys and never return. After all, the dead did not come back, and neither did errands from strangers. But the next morning, a knock came again, then another, the day after that, and another. Not all were children. The tomb were women, the kind who cleaned temple floors and carried water to the priests. Others were laborers, their hands scarred from building tomb walls or dragging stones for the crumbled canal. They brought scraps of papyrus, burnt scroll edges, or simple mud tablets, smooth, flat, and blank. All they asked for was the same thing, a name, sometimes the name of a child, sometimes of a father, sometimes of a neighbor who had no family left to remember them. "I can't pay you," they'd say, and Hepat would always answer the same way, "I'm not asking." What could you charge for memory? The temple stewards began to notice. Scrolls arrived daily now, many bearing Hepat's precise hand. The old priest of Sachat, the goddess of writing, sent an assistant to see her. He offered her a bench beneath the scriptorium roof, shade, fresh ink, a small loaf of honey bread each week. She refused, not because she was ungrateful, but because writing, for her, was never meant to be done in public. Not anymore. She preferred her home, a cracked window letting in the river wind, the smell of old firewood, the sound of pigeons flapping lazily on the roof. She preferred to write while sitting on her husband's old mat, legs crossed, back hunched gently like a potter over clay. And so the city bent to her will. Letters came to her now, folded tight and wrapped with thread, names scratched into broken tiles, bits of wood with the ends blackened by fire, used as makeshift charcoal tablets, all left at her door by the quiet, the grieving, and the patient. And Hepat wrote them all, not just the names, but sometimes their favorite food, the color of their hair, a phrase they always said before falling asleep, even a story, a single moment that no one else remembered, like a girl who once sang to a cow as it died. She wrote them as though the dead were still listening. Perhaps they were. There was one man who never spoke. He came every 7 days, always, at the same time, just before the temple bells. He wore a simple linen robe and a headscarf drawn low over his face. He never knocked. He'd simply left a stone at her door, a different stone each time, black granite, veined white, a river pebble, smooth as bone, a sliver of red quartz wrapped in a leaf dot, and beside it, name, sometimes a man's, sometimes a woman's, once a dog's. Each time, Hepat copied the name carefully, then burned a pinch of incense and pressed the stone against the scroll, as though sealing it with memory. The man never waited for thanks, and she never chased him. Some griefs do not ask to be seen, only acknowledged. Seasons passed. The floodwaters did not return, though the fear of them lived quietly in everyone's chest, like a scar below the skin. The sky remained wide and indifferent. Crops grew again, though more sparingly. Fishermen returned to the river, casting nets that came back light, but not empty. But something else changed, too. People began to speak her name again, not just the widow, but Hepat. It returned slowly on the tongues of children first, then mothers, again, Old men sitting beneath faded awnings, sipping beer, too weak to dull anything except memory. Hepat wrote my father's name. K, they'd say, Hepat saved my brother from being forgotten. She remembered what I couldn't. She did not ask for honor. She only wanted one thing, that when she died, someone would write her name as carefully as she had written theirs. One day, a girl arrived at her door. Not a child, but not yet a woman, either tall, awkward in movement, her elbows too sharp for a frame. She carried no paper, no ink, no offering. Only a small, heavy box. "I am Senab," she said. "My mother said you knew her." Hepit tilted her head. "Who was your mother?" "Duatep," the girl said. The name hit her like the smell of old perfume. It's familiar and gone. They had studied together once, under the same teacher. Duatep had been bold, clever with metaphors, reckless with grammar. She once carved a curse into a temple bench, just to see if anyone would notice. Hadn't I remember her?" Hepit said softly. "She's dead," the girl said. 2 winters ago." There was no pain in her voice, just a firm, mechanical honesty, the kind that children learn when death comes early and often. Senab opened the box. Inside were dozens of small scrolls, bundled carefully with dyed twine. Most were cracked from age. Some had been water damaged. A few were unreadable entirely. "She wrote these," Senab said. She wanted them to be kept. Hepod picked one up. The handwriting was uneven, rushed. A woman writing after dark perhaps, or with shaking hands, or both. "These are her memories?" Hepod asked. The girl nodded. Keen questions. She always asked a lot of those. Hepit smiled. She took the scrolls in gently and set them by the window. "I'll keep them," she said, "and I'll write her name beside mine." Senab looked relieved. Then she added, with awkward resolve, "When you die, I'll write yours too." Hepot chuckled. "Make sure you spell it right," she said, and Senab promised she would. That night, Hepot sat by lamplight, combing through Duatep's scrolls. They were filled with oddities, lists of dreams, complaints about bread crusts, descriptions of people who had since vanished, including one man who was so short he had to use 2 stools to reach the grain jars. But one scroll stood out. It was blank, completely. It's empty. No writing, no symbols, not even a crease. On the back was a single sentence, scribbled upside down in red ink. "This one is for someone who has not been born yet." Hepit stared at it a long time. Then she placed it on the altar, beside her oil lamp, and began to write. What she wrote was not a name. Not at first. She wrote about the river, smell of roasted barley, a taste of figs eaten in secret while hiding from the sun, the feel of a boat tilting under the weight of too many memories, the sound of Tefnek's laughter before sleep. And then she wrote her name. Not large, not boastful, just enough for the gods to see. Then, beneath it, she wrote another name, Dua, he, Tep. Then another, and another, until the scroll was filled edge to edge with the names of those the city had once tried to forget. By morning, she had written 50 names. By sunset, she had started again, not because she had to, but because she understood now. To write a name is to keep it breathing, and as long as her hands could move, she would make sure no name ever drowned again. The older she became, the less her hands obeyed. Where once her fingers moved with the crisp, the sharp confidence of a temple scribe, they now trembled like reeds caught in the breath of a low wind. Her joints ached in the morning, swelled by night, and the slightest shift in weather-sent pain crawling through her knuckles like sand under skin. Yet still, she wrote. Every morning, Heped stirred before the sun. She no longer needed the rooster's call or the boatmen's shouting voices. Her body followed the rhythm of ink and memory now. With the rising of light, came her first offering. One name, written in silence, dipped in oil smoke, and laid beside a clay lamp. Not for show, not for ritual, only for remembering that winter was a long one. The Nile, once bloated and spoiled with its own anger, seemed to withdraw into itself. The river was quiet, the canals thinner, fish grew scarce. Those who once had meat on their bones walked leaner now. Bread was smaller, rats bolder. Tarawood cost twice what it once did. But even in that thin and bitter season, people still came to her door. Not all with names, some only came to sit, to rest in the hush that clung to her little home, to place their hands over the scrolls she had written, rows of them now, stacked in long baskets, bundled in cloths, pressed between cedar planks to guard against insects. She had copied some names 3 times over, others 10. One poor girl she had rewritten 22 times because her mother feared the gods might forget if it wasn't fresh. Hepit never questioned it. Grief was not measured by reason. It had its own logic, and she honored it all. Then came the flood again, but this time it wasn't water, it was fire. A blaze began in the southern reed markets, a cooking fire left too long in the wind, or perhaps a lamp tipped in sleep. No one knew. The fire jumped easily from one thatched roof to the next, leaped across alleyways like a god searching for sacrifices. For hours it raged, swallowing stalls, workshops, and dwellings as if they were no more than dry feathers. Smoke came first, thick, oily, yellow-black, rolling over the neighborhood like a choking curtain. People screamed, pots shattered, chickens scattered. Prayers rose in half-sentences before dissolving into coughing fits. Hippot woke to the smell of burning. Keepa, YRUS, not her own, but close by the time she reached the threshold of her door. The next block had already begun to crackle with heat. The children from the baker's shop ran past her, eyes wide, cheeks ash-streaked. Behind them, a man carried an old woman across his shoulders, her arms limp, her toes dragging. And through it all, the fire came slow, patient, like something. Remembering, she did not flee. Instead, she reached for her scrolls. Not all of them, for there were too many, but the ones wrapped in green linen. The ones marked in red, set aside in a basin beneath her altar. These were not just names. These were lifelines. One by one, she gathered them into a satchel. Her arms were thin now, her breath unsteady, but she moved with the determination of someone used to quiet defiance. She poured water over the threshold, not to stop the fire, but to honor it. Then she stepped out into the street, her sandals wrapped in soaked cloth. Senab found her minutes later. The girl, now grown taller, sharp-eyed, wrapped in the loose confidence of her mother's memory, had come running when she saw the smoke. She found Hepit near the olive tree, her satchel pressed tight to her chest. The scrolls, Senab began. They're safe, Hepit whispered. Some of them. The fire cracked overhead as a roof beam gave way with a wooden scream. Ash rained down like insects, and Senab pulled her arm. We have to go. But Hepit hesitated. She turned one last time to the house. She had lived there through famine and flood, through the death of her husband. Through the years, the gods stopped answering. Every stone, every crack in the wall held her voice. And now, it was burning. She let it. Some memories are not meant to last forever. They found shelter in the stone temple walls that night, along with dozens of others. The sanctuary of Thoth, god of scribes, time, and wisdom, had been spared by luck or by mercy. No one could tell. It stood still, shadowed and patient, its sandstone cold but dry, its halls echoing with the soft murmur of those who had lost everything. Hepit sat in a corner, her scrolls on her lap, her head against the wall. Senab stayed beside her, silent by morning. The fire was out, but much of the quarter was gone. Homes blackened, collapsed, shops reduced to glowing heaps of clay and bone. The sky was still gray, as though morning. And, in that strange silence, the kind that only follows destruction, Hippat made a decision. It was time to let the names go. The following days were a slow ritual. She unwrapped the scrolls, one by one, and read them aloud. Some names she remembered easily, others had blurred. She read them anyway, not to keep them, but to release them, to say, finally, you were here, you mattered, and now you may rest. For each scroll, she offered a pinch of myrrh, a bowl of water, a whisper. Then she burned it, not in anger, not even in grief, but in peace. Ash floats, higher than ink, and some memories are light enough to fly. On the final day, she turned to Senab and gave her a single unburned scroll, the very one with her own name, and Duatep's name, and all the names written together like threads in a loom. Keep this, she said. Senab frowned. But you said just one? Hepit interrupted. Just in case the world forgets again. Senab held the scroll like a sleeping bird, then asked quietly, what should I do when you're gone? Hepit smiled. Write your name, then someone else's, and then keep going. Senab didn't answer, but she understood. Years later, long after the fire, was a rumor, and Hepit's name was spoken only in stories. Archaeologists would uncover a single scroll hidden beneath a layer of silt in a forgotten corner of the city. It was brittle, faded, but legible. It read, to forget a name is to kill a soul twice. So I wrote, till the ink ran dry, and the wind blew the smoke away. Beneath the words were rows upon rows of names, and at the very end, Hippat, scribe of the ashes, and the widow who outlived the flood. The flood. The first light of morning in the highlands did not fall as a beam, but as a hush. It was not a color. It was a silence, a cold one. On the edge of an unnamed outpost monastery, near the river Conwy, where the hills climbed just high enough to lose the sun each evening a little early, there lived a monk named Guyan, who never once raised his eyes to the sky, while his brothers charted the phases of the moon and read the stars to reckon when to plant, when to pray, and when to mourn. Guyan stared down, always at the earth beneath his bare feet, with its stones, its cracks, its slowness. He never questioned it. There are those who seek eternity in fire, thirst in stars. Guyan searched for it in pebbles. He had not always been this way. Long ago, when the monastery was younger and the fires in its hearts still smelled of cedar instead of soot, Guyan was a singer. A boy with a voice like river water, soft, silvery, but quick to vanish behind stone. The older monk said his voice could stir a goose to prayer or coax silence from a chattering drunk. He had sung the Gospels, not in Latin, though he knew them, but in the old tongue, the kind that curled like smoke and tasted like peat and river moss. It was a beautiful voice, until the season. Storms came, the winter of the frost-starved trees. That was what they called it afterward. Snow did not fall in flakes that year, but in blades. The wind howled for days, blowing through the stone cloisters with the sound of 1,000 voices weeping. Roofs cracked, hens froze in their sleep. Bread turned to stone. And on the 7th night, a chimney collapsed above the dining hall, catching. 3 novices under its ash.gwin was among them. The other 2 perished by morning. He did not, but when they pulled him from the rubble, his ribs crushed, throat bloodied, eyes too wide, he no longer sang, could no longer speak. His voice had been stolen, not by death, but by dust. Afterward, he would often sit by the hearth, listening to the other monks chant, his mouth unmoving, his hands open in his lap. They tried to teach him to sign. He refused. They tried to offer him herbs, warm milk, soft cloth, even the company of the abbot. He declined all of it. Then, one morning, he was gone, vanished. No farewell, no sack, no shoes, only a trail of footprints in the frost leading down toward the lower cloister garden, and, beyond that, a river. They assumed the worst, but Guion hadn't drowned. He had simply gone down to the earth. Full moon passed before anyone saw him again. The novice Onion was the first to speak of it. He claimed he'd seen a cloaked figure at dawn, kneeling by the elderberry hedge, silently sorting stones into little rows, black and gray, gray and white, rounded and jagged. Then he vanished behind a wall of fog. The older monks dismissed it, but the stories kept coming. A pile of pebbles shaped like a fish appeared outside the chapel steps. A circle of stones, no larger than lentils, was discovered in the alcove where old Brother Moirig used to nap. One monk found a perfect spiral of river stones in the firewood shed. Another, a tiny pyramid atop the altar in the west chapel. And then, on the 43rd morning after his disappearance, Guion returned, not through the gate, not with a bell, but simply seated beside the cloister well, waiting. He looked the same, or nearly so. His robe was frayed at the hem, his sandals gone, his hair wild but clean. In his lap was a bag, coarse linen, hand-stitched, full of river stones of every color, all smoothed and cool from touch. He nodded to those who passed, then picked up a pebble, held it to the morning light, turned it once, and set it gently beside another dot. After that, he never spoke again, but he never left. The abbot, unsure whether to chastise or commend him, eventually relented. A corner of the herb garden was set aside for him. A bench was offered. And so began the ritual of Guion's new life. Each morning at dawn, he would walk to the river. Each evening, he would return in his satchel, stones, not large ones, never sharp, never dirty. Each pebble was chosen with monastic precision, as though he were building not a garden of rocks, but a library of forgotten thoughts. Some monks mocked him. They called him the pebble priest, a silent fool, the dust keeper. Others feared him, not out of malice, but from something quieter, deeper, perhaps. For while they debated theology and copied scripture and counted seasons by moonlight, Guion seemed to move in a different time altogether. He had no need for calendars. He needed no stars. He counted pebbles, and, curiously, he remembered them. One evening, Brother Easton tried to trick him by swapping 2 stones in a row of 16, one pale pink with a crack down its side, and another smoother, duller, gray. The next morning, before anyone had stirred, Guion had corrected it, without looking. Another time, Brother Riders hid a stone from Guion's satchel. Later that day, when Riders returned to his cell, he found the stone resting quietly in his boot, warmed by the hearth. No accusation, no rebuke, just a pebble. In place, it was the old gardener, Sister Selen, who came closest to understanding him, though women were not allowed to speak freely with monks in the cloister. She would often nod to him as he walked past, and he would nod back. Sometimes they shared the bench during the silent hour. One morning, she brought him tea. He drank it, and the next morning left a perfect heart of red stones at the edge of her plot, shaped so carefully it seemed to pulse. The following season, she retired her trowel. Her knees had given out, but she entrusted Guion with her favorite task, the herb record, instead of writing dates. He marked time by stones, one white pebble for every frost, one green for every rain, black for birdsong, amber for fox tracks, blue for loss. He never explained the system, but somehow the herb beds flourished. When the bishop visited from the coast that spring, the abbot presented his scrolls, his scriptures, his plans for expansion. But it was Guion's pebble garden the bishop noticed. "What is this?" the bishop asked, brow furrowed. "A penance," the abbot said uncertainly. A silence, a sort of living psalter. The bishop crouched, studied the patterns. A labyrinth here, a Celtic, not there. A ringed cross made entirely of river glass, and names, perhaps, in the long rows. He couldn't be sure. He stood again, brushing off his robes. "I've never seen anything like it," he murmured. Then, after a moment, it calms the soul. And, for once, the abbot said nothing. That summer, the drought came. The river shrank. Wells dried. Chickens refused to lay. The vines curled brown and stiff, and the monks began to ration their wine. But each day, Gion still walked to the river. Each day, he returned with the satchel, lighter now, but never empty. One dawn, the sky cracked with thunder, a tea, but no rain came, only wind. That was the day they found the first message in the center of the cloister garden. Carefully etched in fine dust lay a perfect spiral of white stones. At its center, a single piece of black basalt, smooth and round as an eye. Sister Selin knelt beside it. "It's a warning," she said. The abbot disagreed. He brushed the stones away, muttering that this was nonsense. But the next morning, the pattern returned, more intricate, now with tiny arrows of green stone radiating outward, and beside it, a single acorn, not from the monastery's own tree, but from the deep wood. That evening, Gion did not return. He was gone again. No footprints. This time, no clues, just a satchel of stones left beside the well, half full, and a circle of reeds pressed into the grass. The monks searched for 2 days, but Gion had vanished. Some believed he had gone to live with hermits in the mountains. Others said he had died and been taken by the spirits of the stream. A few whispered that he had simply dissolved like the voice he once lost. But Sister Selin believed otherwise. She planted a small tree in the garden where his stones had lain. Beneath it, she buried the satchel, and beside it, she placed a single message. Not all things must be spoken. Some are counted, and some simply rest. Simply rest. There is a silence that clings to dry air, not like peace, not like stillness, but like a hunger unmet. And in the cloister, after Gion vanished, that silence took on the shape of bells, bells that did not ring, ropes that hung limp in their towers, clappers stiff with dust. There were no deaths that summer, and so no tolling, but there were no baptisms either, no celebrations, no pilgrims to greet, no masses sung under clear skies, only the ringing absence of noise. Even the birds seemed to leave, even the bees. What remained was the rhythm of feet, of cloaks brushing past hedges, of parchment rustling like dried leaves, and of hands, rough, silent hands, turning pages, turning loaves, turning soil. The monks moved slowly, but they moved, and in the center of their movements, like a heartbeat forgotten, but still thudding faintly beneath the rib cage, there was Gion's tree. The sapling did not grow quickly. Its leaves were small, pale green, fragile as fish scales, but it lived. And beneath its thin roots, nestled in the cool soil where Sister Selin had buried the satchel, the earth felt oddly soft, as if something stirred gently there. Something like breath. The herb garden, once lively with whispers and herbal debates, had become a place of quiet watchfulness. Sister Selin no longer tended the plots herself, but she came often to sit beside the tree. She would press her palm into the dirt as if listening through her hand. Sometimes she hummed a low, tuneless murmur that neither matched any psalm nor contradicted it, just sound, like a lullaby meant only for the soil. Once a week she brought a new stone, smooth, clean, chosen from her own small walks, and placed it gently at the base of the tree. She never arranged them, never sculpted symbols, just set them down one at a time, like offerings. It's like memory. The younger novices copied her. A line of stones began to form, and then a second, and then a circle by the start of the next moon. It was clear that someone had been moving the stones at night. Nothing dramatic, just slight shifts, angles tilted, swapped, 3 stacked, where before they had lain flat. Brother Carwin was the first to comment, pointing out that the circle was no longer quite a circle. It had become an ellipse, then a spiral, then a chain of chevrons pointing east. The monks were puzzled, but no one intervened. Then the messages began. Not words, never words, but something deeper, something quieter. Shapes began to appear in the garden before dawn. Spirals, grids, stars made of flint and quartz. Some small, no larger than a plate, others the size of cloister windows. Each formation lasted a day before being gently rearranged or buried. No one saw who was doing it. No one claimed the patterns, but every morning, they were there. It was Brother Moirig, the oldest monk in the cloister, who finally spoke aloud. What? Many had silently wondered. It's Guion, he said, during a rare communal meal. He's not gone. He's only underneath. No one laughed. Not even the skeptic Brother Riderch. Not even the abbot. They simply returned to chewing their barley bread. Eyes half lowered, and the fire crackled between them. That autumn, the river dried further. By the end of September, it was only a trickle. The well-dropped bucket ropes stretching deeper each week. Rain did not come. The apples shriveled on their branches. The lambs bleated with parched tongues. The leaves turned not red, not gold, but brown, and fell without ceremony. And yet, the tree in the herb garden grew tiny. Yes, frail, yes, but taller, firmer. The color of its bark deepened, and its leaves held their green just a bit longer than the others. Some monks began to sit beside it during their scripture readings. Others placed their rosaries there, hoping, perhaps, for clarity. The pebble patterns continued, each one more intricate, more refined, until one morning a perfect labyrinth appeared around the tree, with a single entrance and a winding path of pebbles leading to its center. It took the novices nearly an hour to trace it, and when they did, they found a message, a small ring of blue stones at the heart of the labyrinth, with one black stone in the middle round, polished and warm to the touch. The abbot began to take notice. He asked the novices to begin documenting the patterns, not for doctrine, said, but for ... preservation. A scribe was assigned. Each morning before sunrise, he would trace the patterns onto vellum using charcoal and measured strength. After a week, he noticed something strange. Each formation echoed the next. The spiral became a lattice. The lattice became a wheel. The wheel became a braid, each one building on the one before, as if a thought were slowly unfolding, not in words, but in patterns, like a language made of stillness, a grammar of stone. The scribe called it public. It was in late October, on the eve of All Saints, when the silence broke rain. Not much, just a drizzle, but enough. The cloister bells rang for the first time in over a year. Their clang was awkward at first, as if the metal had forgotten its purpose. But then the note settled, deep and round, echoing through the damp air like ancient laughter. The monks gathered in the cloister. Some cried, some just lifted their faces to the drizzle. And at the center of it all, by the tree, the pebble labyrinth had changed again. Now it formed a complete circle, surrounding the tree like a halo. It's a spiral within a spiral, with only one path leading inward at the core. Where the black stone had been, there now lay a single folded leaf, shaped like a heart, damp but unblemished. And beneath it, a single red stone, glowing faintly. No one touched it in the weeks that followed. The river rose, the wells returned, the fields softened, and the sheep began to bleat again, this time with voices fuller than before. A few villagers returned. Its pilgrims passed through. A merchant left, its 2 sacks of grain in gratitude for dry shelter, and Guion did not return. But neither did he vanish. His silence That particular silence remained. It rested in the corners of the garden, in the smoothness of the pebbles, in the way the tree rustled without wind, in the way the stones still shifted slightly by morning, forming arcs, stairways, and spirals that meant something, even if no one could quite say what. Sister Selin passed the garden work to another novice, but she still came once a week to sit beneath the tree. Sometimes she whispered, sometimes she sang, and always, always she left a pebble behind, somewhere, perhaps beneath the soil, or perhaps only in memory. Guion continued his counting, not of days, not of steps, not of prayers, but of something more precise, more enduring, the shape of silence, the weight of rain, the memory of a voice that had once been river-dash song, and the stillness beneath it all, where eternity wasn't distant, only small and round, and resting in the palm of a hand. The winters in the cloister were quiet again. But this time, the quiet was no longer empty. It was full of memory, full of shapes, full of quiet evidence that something remained beneath the surface. By the time the first frost painted the edges of the cloister arches, the monks had accepted that Guion's body would never be found. The river had long since turned shallow, then generous again. Its shifting moods, like a wandering mind, left little behind. But the pebble patterns continued, now changing with the seasons. In winter, they curled into snowflakes. In spring, they unfolded into branches. In summer, they stretched long and wide like sun rays, radiating from the base of the tree. And in autumn, they returned to spirals, always the spirals. Spirals made of pebbles, the color of bread crust and bone and rain. Brother Moiric passed quietly during the feast of Saint Alred. His last words, spoken to no one in particular, were, "He was the smallest bell, but he's still ringing." He was buried near the east wall, but the next morning, a small circle of pebbles appeared at the base of the tree again, just a ring of 7. All gray, smooth as glass. The monks said nothing, but each nodded. Some closed their eyes a moment longer during prayer. It was Brother Taufrin, the cloister's quietest scribe, who first began copying the pebble formations into a book of his own. He didn't ask permission. He simply woke each morning before the others, sketched the shape in charcoal, and later inked it onto thick parchment. He numbered them in the margins, not by date, but by their shape. The first spiral he labeled 1A. The spiral with a double loop was 1B. The wheel with 12 spokes was 3C. He gave them names: the listening circle, the labyrinth of return, the rain star grid. But mostly, he just wrote what he saw, and at the bottom of each page, he added a small Latin inscription, always the same, verbum impetra, the word in the stone. Over time, the vellum grew thick with shapes. Taufrin realized he wasn't merely recording art or ritual. He was, somehow, copying a language. A scripture with no letters, a psalter with no psalms. A record of something, real and unfolding, but told not through voices or ink, or even dreams, only through stones. The stone psalter. They began calling it. Not all monks believed it was Guion. Some said the wind moved the stones. Some said mice. One novice insisted it was the crows. But even he stopped arguing after one morning, when the pebbles spelled out the shape of a feather, a perfect one, made of flint and dust and blue-streaked shale. It lasted only until noon. A crow flew low overhead. Then it scattered. 3 years passed. The tree now stood taller than a man. Its bark had hardened, and its limbs cast delicate shadows in the herb garden. The sapling was no longer a curiosity. It was a landmark, a friend. On feast days, candles were set near its roots. On mourning days, pebbles were brought by the handful and arranged silently by pilgrims who never knew Guion's name. Only the story, for the story had grown. Villagers, once dismissive of the cloister's strangeness, now whispered of the monk who vanished into the river and left behind a tree that spoke in silence. Some claimed the pebbles healed small illnesses. Others said dreams came clearer when sleeping near the tree. One woman claimed her lost child had found her way home after placing a stone at the roots. The monks did not confirm or deny. They simply watched and listened, and each morning when a new pattern emerged, they copied it, not to explain it, only to remember. On the 5th anniversary of Gwen's disappearance, the abbot, old now and bent, called the entire cloister to the garden. It was late spring. The air held the scent of wet moss and bread. He stood beside the tree and spoke only once. "I believe some prayers are not spoken," he said. "They are arranged." Then he knelt and placed a single stone. It was not smooth. It was not round. It was jagged, dark, and chipped on one side. But he set it down carefully, right at the threshold of that morning's spiral. And when he stood, he was crying. The bells rang again that evening, not for death, but for memory, for arrangement, for the way time itself had bent, for a moment to allow one small monk to leave behind, not a voice, not a book, not a relic, but a pattern, a grammar, a stillness. Decades passed. The cloister aged. Some wings crumbled. New brothers came. Others left. But the tree remained, and so did the patterns. By the time Brother Taufren passed, Stone Psalter contained 437 entries. Some were simple: a ring, a star, a cross made of sea stone. Others were so complex they required 4 pages of diagrams. But each one bore the same inscription at the bottom: Verbum in Petra. The word in the stone. No new scribe dared to change it. Even when the vellum ran out and new folios were sewn from cloth, bark, and red, the phrase remained. It had become the cloister's quiet creed. Not doctrine, not law, just memory, and still. No one knew what the shapes meant, but they knew this. They meant something, because they recurred. A spiral from the 2nd year returned in the 29th. A pattern once seen in the frost appeared again in the spring mud, unchanged. There were echoes, mirrors, rhythms. One monk, years later, proposed that the shapes were like music, but not heard, only seen. Pebble chords, stone notes, ranged on the ground as one might arrange air on a string. Another suggested they were maps, not of land, but of time. Perhaps of thought, of prayer, of love, even whatever love looked like when it had no hands, no lips, no need to be received, only given in the final pages of the Stone Psalter. There is a drawing from the 51st year of the garden. The shape is familiar, a spiral, but at its center is a twist, not an inward loop, but a branching. Like a Y dot, it splits, curves, and reunites. Taufren's successor, Brother Honorine, labeled it the Unforgotten Path. Below it, no Latin, only 3 words in the monk's own Welsh: Me e da lima. He is still here, and so ends the record. Not in fire, not in ruin, but in arrangement, in a language made of dust and patience, of things left unsaid, of a boy who counted pebbles not because he needed to, but because he couldn't help it, because he saw something in their shapes, something that no one else had the stillness to see. And so, when he was gone, the stones spoke for him, and centuries later, they still do. You just have to slow down enough to listen, not with ears, but with hands, and with the silence that waits beneath every question, the silence that remembers the sound of a single pebble, placed just so, just so.